What if I told you the greatest race in human history wasn't about winning? It was about survival. That behind the soaring rockets and triumphant speeches lay a story of betrayal, heartbreak, and ambition so reckless it nearly burned a superpower to the ground. The Soviet Union once stood on the brink of dominating space, poised to conquer the heavens and leave their rivals in the dust. They had the vision, the brilliance, and the audacity to change the course of history. But something went terribly wrong. How did the nation that sent humanity's first satellite into orbit, that gave us Yuri Gagarin, the first man to touch the stars, end up watching their dreams of cosmic glory come crashing down? What forces, both within and without, conspired to turn their triumphs into tragedies? This is the untold story of how the Soviet Union reached for the stars and fell back to Earth. A story of genius overshadowed by ambition, of victories marred by loss, and of decisions made not in the name of progress, but in the cold, calculating shadow of geopolitics. Stay with me as we uncover the secrets of the Soviet space race, a tale of soaring dreams and shattering betrayals, where every success carried the weight of impending failure. The Soviet Union was the first to conquer space. In 1957, as the world held its breath, a tiny satellite, no bigger than a beach ball, soared into orbit. Its name was Sputnik, and its rhythmic beeps from the heavens sent shockwaves across the globe. The Soviet Union was triumphant, its prestige reaching new heights. They had beaten the Americans, proving not only their technological superiority, but also the strength of their ideology. It was the ultimate victory in the early days of the Cold War. But alongside this triumph was a darker, more fragile reality, one that would ultimately lead to heartbreak and collapse. For every successful launch, there were explosions on the launch pad. For every Yuri Gagarin hailed as a hero of humanity, there were countless engineers laboring in obscurity, crushed by impossible deadlines and political interference. Beneath the veneer of Soviet success, cracks were forming. In the mid-20th century, the space race was not just a contest of science. It was a battleground of ideology, technology, and power. To the Soviet Union, space was more than the final frontier. It was the proving ground for their supremacy. But as the race escalated, something shifted. The victories slowed, the failures mounted, and the Americans surged ahead. Why did the Soviet Union, the nation that started with such a commanding lead, falter so dramatically? The answer lies in a tangled web of ambition, betrayal, and relentless geopolitical pressure. What role did internal politics play? How did the Cold War arms race siphon resources from their cosmic dreams? And could history have turned out differently if key decisions or key lives had taken a different course? To understand the collapse of the Soviet space program, we must go back to where it all began. It was 1945. The world was scarred from the Second World War, and both the United States and the Soviet Union raced to claim the spoils of war. Among those spoils were the scientists who had built Germany's V-2 rockets. The Americans claimed many, but the Soviets secured their own share. From this grim inheritance, the Soviet space program was born. By the 1950s, it became clear that space would be the ultimate theater for Cold War rivalry. In Moscow, Sergei Korolev, the enigmatic and visionary engineer, emerged as the driving force behind the Soviet effort. Korolev wasn't just an engineer, he was a dreamer, a man who believed in humanity's destiny among the stars. Under his leadership, the Soviets made history, the first satellite, the first dog in space, the first man in orbit. But Korolev worked under immense pressure. Every project was a race, every failure a potential disaster. He faced constant interference from party officials who cared more about propaganda than practicality. And yet, Korolev persevered, his genius shielding the program from collapse. But then, in 1966, tragedy struck. Korolev died suddenly during routine surgery. His death marked the beginning of the Soviet Union's unraveling in space. Without his steady hand, the program descended into chaos. Rivalries emerged among his successors, each competing for resources and favor with party leaders. Ambition turned to infighting, and projects that once embodied hope became mired in dysfunction. As the Soviet Union stumbled, the Americans surged forward. The Apollo program, backed by billions of dollars and united by Kennedy's bold vision, set its sights on the moon. The Soviets, meanwhile, struggled to catch up. Their N-1 moon rocket, a massive, ambitious project, was plagued by technical issues. Time and again, it exploded on the launch pad, each failure a devastating blow. Behind the scenes, engineers worked tirelessly, often under conditions that would break lesser men. They faced impossible deadlines, inadequate funding, and a constant fear of failure. Yet they persevered, driven by the hope that their work might restore the glory of Soviet space exploration. But hope wasn't enough. The cracks in the program were too deep, the geopolitical pressures too overwhelming. The Cold War arms race diverted critical resources away from the space program. The Soviet Union, already stretched thin, prioritized military spending over space exploration. The rivalry with the United States wasn't confined to the stars. It was being fought in proxy wars, in nuclear stockpiles, and in the hearts and minds of people around the world. And then in 1969, the unthinkable happened. The Americans landed on the moon. Apollo 11's success was a seismic moment, not just for the United States, but for the world. For the Soviets, it was a crushing defeat. Their dreams of cosmic domination, so bright in the days of Sputnik and Gagarin, seemed to dim overnight. But the story doesn't end there. The Soviet Union continued its space effort, achieving remarkable feats like the first space station, Salyut, and pioneering long-term human spaceflight. Yet these victories were overshadowed by their inability to match the Americans' lunar triumph. What if things had been different? What if Korolev had lived? What if the N-1 rocket had succeeded? Could the Soviet Union have won the space race, altering the course of history? These are questions that linger, tantalizing and unresolved. In the end, the Soviet space program was a story of extraordinary achievement and devastating failure. It was a story of men and women who dared to dream of the stars, only to be betrayed by the very system they served. It was a story of triumphs that inspired the world and tragedies that revealed the human cost of ambition. As we look to the future of space exploration, the legacy of the Soviet Union reminds us of the delicate balance between vision and reality, between the pursuit of greatness and the need for unity. It is a legacy that continues to shape our journey to the stars, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. And so, as we reflect on the rise and fall of the Soviet space program, we are left with a profound question. What price are we willing to pay to reach the heavens? The Soviet Union, a nation sprawling across 11 time zones, was vast in both ambition and geography. From the icy tundra of Siberia to the deserts of Central Asia, its sheer scale seemed like an insurmountable obstacle to most endeavors. But in the 20th century, this vastness became a stage for one of humanity's greatest competitions, the space race. The launch pads of Baikonur Cosmodrome, hidden deep within the Kazakh steppes, symbolized the Soviet Union's cosmic ambitions. Proximity to the equator offered an advantage in achieving orbit, while the remoteness of their sites promised security. Yet this geographic expanse came with challenges. Moving colossal rocket components across rugged terrain over thousands of miles was a logistical nightmare. Compare this to the United States. NASA's centralized operations, anchored by the streamlined infrastructure of Cape Canaveral, Florida, allowed efficiency and precision. Where the Soviets relied on the endurance of their workforce to overcome distance and scarcity, the Americans used proximity and modern transportation networks. Could it be that geography itself doomed the Soviet dream of space supremacy? Or was it something deeper, rooted in the very fabric of their political and social system? The space race wasn't born of mere curiosity. It was forged in the fires of war. After World War II, both the United States and the Soviet Union raced to capture Germany's rocket scientists. Among them was Wernher von Braun, the architect of the V-2 rocket, who went on to become a cornerstone of NASA's Apollo program. The Soviets, too, claimed their share of expertise, laying the foundation for their own bold endeavors, and bold they were. In 1957, the Soviets shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. Its faint beeps from orbit sent ripples of awe and fear across the globe. 4 years later, they did it again, sending Yuri Gagarin into space, making him the first human to orbit Earth. These were not just scientific triumphs, they were geopolitical statements, proof that Soviet ingenuity could rival and even surpass the West. But behind these dazzling achievements was a man whose name was shrouded in secrecy at the time, Sergei Korolev. Known only as the chief designer, Korolev was the mastermind behind the Soviet space program. A survivor of Stalin's purges and labor camps, he was a man of vision and tenacity whose dreams seemed boundless. Under his leadership, the Soviets appeared unstoppable, a colossus marching toward the stars. Yet even as the Soviets celebrated these milestones, cracks began to appear. The victories came at a cost, a frantic pace of development driven more by political pressure than scientific prudence. Korolev himself bore the weight of impossible deadlines, juggling limited resources while navigating the treacherous waters of Soviet bureaucracy. His team was brilliant but overworked, their potential stifled by a system that valued propaganda as much as progress. Then came 1966. Korolev, the irreplaceable genius, was gone, lost to complications from surgery. His death was a devastating blow. Without him, the program faltered. Rival factions within the Soviet leadership squabbled over direction and resources. Unlike NASA, which had a unified vision underpinned by massive funding and public support, the Soviet program became a fragmented shadow of its former self. Nowhere was this dysfunction more evident than in the race to the moon. Determined to match the Americans' Apollo program, the Soviets pinned their hopes on the N-1 rocket, a behemoth designed to carry cosmonauts to the lunar surface. But the N-1 was plagued with problems, underfunded, rushed, and overseen by a disjointed leadership. 4 times it was launched, and 4 times it failed, each explosion more catastrophic than the last. Meanwhile, the Americans pressed forward. Backed by President Kennedy's vision and billions of dollars in funding, NASA's Apollo program was an engineering marvel. In 1969, the world watched as Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. For the United States, it was a moment of triumph. For the Soviet Union, it was a moment of despair. The moon landing was more than a technological victory. It was a symbolic blow to Soviet prestige. The propaganda machine that had celebrated Sputnik and Gagarin now faced an uncomfortable truth. The United States had outpaced them. The Soviet leadership scrambled to save face, diverting attention to other projects like space stations and Mars probes. These efforts were impressive, but lacked the unifying power of a lunar landing. But why did the Soviets fail to maintain their early lead? The answers lie not just in technology, but in the geopolitics of the Cold War. The arms race drained resources that might have gone to space exploration. Every ruble spent on rockets was a ruble not spent on missiles or tanks, and the Soviet Union, locked in a global struggle with the United States, prioritized military might over scientific discovery. Diplomatic isolation compounded the problem. While NASA benefited from partnerships with allies like Canada and Western Europe, the Soviets operated in near-total secrecy, unwilling to share technology or risk exposing their weaknesses. This isolation not only hindered innovation, but also deprived them of the collaborative spirit that propelled Apollo to success. The strains of the Cold War extended beyond space. Proxy wars in Vietnam, Africa, and the Middle East drained both superpowers' budgets, but the Soviet Union, with its less robust economy, bore the brunt of this strain. By the 1970s, the cracks in the Soviet system were growing wider, threatening to engulf not just the space program, but the nation itself. And yet, it's impossible not to wonder, what if things had been different? What if Sergei Korolev had lived? What if the N-1 rocket had succeeded? What if the Soviet Union had won the race to the moon? Imagine a world where a cosmonaut, not an astronaut, planted their flag on the lunar surface. Such a victory might have extended Soviet influence across the globe, bolstering its ideological appeal and altering the trajectory of the Cold War. Perhaps it could have even delayed the Soviet Union's eventual collapse, providing a rallying point for national pride and unity. But history is not built on what-ifs. It is shaped by choices, by moments of triumph and failure, by the people who dare to dream and the systems that either support or betray those dreams. The Soviet space program, even in its decline, achieved remarkable feats. They pioneered space stations, laying the groundwork for the modern International Space Station. They sent probes to Venus and Mars, expanding humanity's understanding of the cosmos. But these successes were bittersweet, overshadowed by the unfulfilled promise of their early triumphs. As we look back, the story of the Soviet space race is not just a tale of rockets and cosmonauts. It is a human story, a testament to the power of vision and the tragedy of missed opportunities. It reminds us of the extraordinary heights we can reach when we dare to dream, and the depths to which we can fall when those dreams are undone by ambition, rivalry, and the weight of our own limitations. The Soviet Union reached for the stars, and though they stumbled, their legacy endures. It is a legacy of brilliance and resilience, of triumph and heartbreak, of a people who dared to believe that the sky was not the limit, but the beginning. The Soviet Union's journey into space began with a dream of exploring the unknown, of standing at the forefront of human achievement, and of proving to the world that their system, their people, and their ingenuity was second to none. But as the Cold War intensified, that dream became entangled in something far more sinister. A bitter struggle for dominance, where triumphs and betrayals unfolded against the backdrop of a divided world. Do you think the space race was truly about exploration, or was it just another front in the battle for global supremacy? To understand, we must go back to the beginning. In 1957, the world stood still. A faint beeping sound from space heralded a new era. Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, had been launched by the Soviet Union. It was a moment of awe and fear, a demonstration of technological prowess that sent shockwaves through the United States. The space race had begun, and for a brief, shining moment, the Soviets seemed invincible. Just 4 years later, they did it again. Yuri Gagarin, a young cosmonaut with a bright smile, became the first human to orbit the Earth. His voice crackled over the radio as he gazed down at the planet, proclaiming, "I see Earth. It is so beautiful." It wasn't just a triumph for the Soviet Union. It was a triumph for humanity. For a moment, it felt like the stars were within reach. But beneath the celebrations, tensions simmered. The Soviet space program, driven by the brilliant but enigmatic Sergei Korolev, was already beginning to show signs of strain. Resources were scarce, and political interference was constant. Every success came at a cost, one paid not just in rubles, but in sleepless nights, shattered dreams, and lives lost in the relentless pursuit of glory. As the United States rallied under President Kennedy's bold promise to land a man on the moon, the Soviet Union faced a grueling reality. The Cold War was not just a competition of rockets and astronauts. It was a battle of economies, ideologies, and priorities. Every ruble funneled into space exploration was a ruble not spent on tanks, missiles, or the endless wars of influence being fought across the globe. Sergei Korolev, the heart and soul of the Soviet space program, pushed forward with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He believed in the dream of space, not just as a battlefield of the Cold War, but as humanity's destiny. But in 1966, tragedy struck. Korolev died unexpectedly during routine surgery, and with him went the vision and cohesion that had propelled the Soviet Union to its early successes. Without Korolev, the program faltered. Leadership fragmented, rival factions vied for control, and decisions were made not by scientists, but by bureaucrats with little understanding of the challenges at hand. It was as if the Soviet Union had lost its compass, drifting further from the stars with every passing year. Meanwhile, the Americans surged ahead. NASA, with its centralized structure and vast resources, was methodical and relentless. The Apollo program represented the full might of a united effort, backed by billions of dollars and an unyielding public mandate. In 1969, the world watched as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stepped onto the lunar surface. "One small step for man," Armstrong said, "one giant leap for mankind." It was a moment of triumph for the United States and a devastating blow to the Soviet Union. For the Soviets, the moon landing was more than a technological defeat. It was a symbolic humiliation. The N-1 rocket, their last hope of reaching the moon, had failed spectacularly in a series of catastrophic launches. Engineers once hailed as heroes were now scapegoats for a system that had prioritized propaganda over progress. But what if it had been different? What if the N1 had succeeded? What if Korolev had lived to see his vision realized? Imagine a world where a Soviet cosmonaut, not an American astronaut, planted their flag on the lunar surface. How would history have changed? How would global alliances have shifted? The space race, however, was never just about the moon. It was about proving whose way of life was superior, whose system could push humanity further, faster and higher. Yet as both superpowers poured billions into space exploration, the toll became apparent. Proxy wars, economic strain and internal dissent began to erode the foundations of both nations. The Cold War was no longer a race to the stars, but a desperate struggle to avoid collapse. For the Soviet Union, the pressures were immense. The arms race, diplomatic isolation, and a stagnant economy left little room for the grand dreams of the early 1960s. While NASA turned its gaze toward long-term exploration and international cooperation, the Soviets focused on survival. Space stations like Mir became their new frontier. Impressive, but a far cry from the glory of a moon landing. The story of the Soviet space race is one of triumph and heartbreak, of dreams realized and ambitions shattered. It is the story of a nation that reached for the stars but was pulled back by the weight of its own contradictions. Yet, even in failure, the Soviet Union left a legacy that endures to this day. They were the first to breach the atmosphere, the first to send a human into orbit, and the first to imagine a future where humanity might one day live among the stars. Do you think the space race was more about exploration or dominance? Perhaps it was both. It was a competition that pushed humanity to its limits, revealing not just the heights we can achieve, but the costs we are willing to pay. The space race may have ended, but its lessons still echo in today's global competition for technological supremacy. As nations vie for dominance in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and space colonization, we are reminded that the pursuit of greatness is never without sacrifice. If this story has captivated you, join us for more deep dives into the hidden stories of geopolitics. And if you want to explore how the Cold War shaped modern alliances, check out our next video. Together, we'll uncover the secrets that continue to shape our world. Thank you for watching this video on Geopolitics, where we dive deep into the stories that shape our world. If you enjoyed this journey through history and geopolitics, don't forget to like this video and share it with others who might find it just as fascinating. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our growing community here at WGP's HQ. By subscribing, you'll ensure you never miss out on the incredible stories and insights we'll be sharing in the weeks to come. Your support helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into the events and forces that define our world. Thanks again for being part of the journey, and I'll see you in the next video.